Atlus Company Limited began as a video game developer in 1986, and they hit the ground running with their first game, a Japanese-only traditional role-playing game called Digital Devil Story: Megami Tensei. It was hugely acclaimed, and they continued releasing games in its universe throughout the early 90s, under the regular Megami Tensei banner, as well as the new Shin Megami Tensei name. In 1994, they released Shin Megami Tensei If, which instead of being an epic fantasy adventure, was a small-scale story set in a high school. This inspired Atlus to develop a sort of spiritual spin-off called Revelations Persona, that dealt as much with the adolescent interpersonal struggles of high school life as it did with the infestation of demons attacking its characters. In 1998, they were working on 2 sequels to Persona, Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment, each its own super intricate, very complicated RPG. Once those games were completed, the team reported feeling some exhaustion, working exclusively in the Persona universe specifically, and the role-playing genre generally, and decided that the release of the new Dreamcast console was an opportunity to take things in a different direction. Their initial plan was a simple, low-key combat game, and in some ways, the game that resulted, Maken X, is exactly that. But, you know how when you're driving on the highway, and you exit to the surface roads, and it's hard to stop going 60 for a while before you adjust? Fresh off multiple Persona games, the Atlus team couldn't help but make things overcomplicated. Maken X is set in a near-future Earth where the EU is collapsing during rising tensions between the US and China, and there are societal factions that have developed special genes, a primary group called the Blade Masters, and an offshoot called the Sangokai. They have differing levels of psi, which is described essentially as a spiritual concept that is the source of emotion and sensation. The Sangokai have warped psi that has malformed their bodies. The Maken is an artificial being that has, quote, direct access to the world of psi, which mostly manifests as the ability to inhabit other people's minds and control their bodies, an experience the game refers to as brainjacking. The game opens with a team activating the Maken and being attacked by a member of the Sangokai. So the Maken brainjacks the project director's daughter, Kay, to save everyone's lives. But now Kay is trapped in the psi realm with an evil being called Geist, and the Maken has to keep brainjacking people to save both Kay and the world. As you can see, the plot gets complicated. But honestly, even with all this convolution, the actual gameplay breaks down on a pretty basic level. The game operates from a first-person perspective, and sees you traversing corridors and hallways, slashing random enemies with a sword or other weapon. You pick up health capsules as well as these blobs, which it took me hours to figure out were for building up the mental capital to be able to brainjack people. The brainjacking doesn't amount to a whole lot experientially, since even as you're jumping from person to person, it's in first person, and most of the weapons do relatively similar melee actions. The game presents you with binary options on whether you want to brainjack specific people they offer you, and apparently the game has branching pathways depending upon which choices you make. But it's literally a simple yes-no, so I never selected no for any of them because there wasn't any compelling reason to do so, and I didn't find out it could have changed my playthrough until later. Like a lot of these games that sport ridiculously convoluted narratives, the actual experience of playing it takes a distinct backseat to the storytelling. I mentioned on the Sword of the Berserk Guts' Rage episode that I found that game a bit of a chore because there was so much in the way of cutscenes, and then the actual action we did get was underwhelming hack-and-slash stuff. Maken X is much the same. Back on the MDK2 episode, I discussed how functionally the entire Dreamcast lifespan took place in the era immediately before the release of Halo on the Xbox in the fall of 2001, which became essentially the gold standard for dual-stick FPSs and revolutionized the genre, being so ergonomic that basically everything made before it in those genres feels near unplayable. I think Maken X is fairly stiff and awkward, but in its context, much more manageable than something like Turok 2, where the game makes you physically stop every time you fire your weapon. I was giving it some pre-2001 benefit of the doubt, but in my research, I found that a lot of reviewers at the time cited it for being a bit rigid and clunky as well, so I won't excuse it too much. My main problem here is just how repetitive most of the combat is, in that the winning strategy for basically the entirety of the game is just jump over him and hit him in the back, a move the game introduces to you in the first 10 minutes of gameplay, and never improves upon. The initial response from Japanese critics was super high, and it got mostly positive notes from international publications, although a lot settled on it being more of a rental than a purchase. Aesthetically, the game's animation runs well, but too often the settings are pretty bland. The cutscenes sport a lot of wild locales, but the actual action mostly takes place in a repetitive series of anonymous, vaguely metal-colored corridors. Also, the English language dub of the voices was recorded by what appears to be the entire English cast of the demented survival horror disaster piece, Blue Stinger.
Not too bad for an artificial brain.
Say it like you mean it.
Forget it if you don't have an ID card.
I like it, Janine.
Who the hell is Janine?
My kind of girl, so stay away from her.
Which was very dissonant for me personally for a number of reasons. It also sounds like each individual person recorded their dialogue in a broom closet, so it doesn't really hit that well. In the spring of 2001, barely 18 months after original Japanese release, Atlus developed a remake of Maken X for the PlayStation 2 called Maken X Demon Sword. Most of the game carried over, but they adjusted it from a first-person to a third-person perspective due to an issue known as 3D sickness, afflicting a lot of Japanese gamers at the time. I prefer the look of the third-person view now, but the first-person gave it a distinctive appearance in 1999, before the FPS boom truly took off, and Maken X feels unique among the Dreamcast lineup, even if I don't have much interest in ever playing it again. Next time, let's take it back to '79.